Next up, I am very proud to introduce our next presenter. This is Nick Wilson. Nick is a long-time baseball fan with a passion for the history of the game. He owns and operates Frame Shop Media, a Des Moines-based production company focused on video and interactive media. Please welcome Nick.
Thank you. So this is me and my dad. We're both big baseball fans and big Royals fans, obviously. And last summer we had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take a trip down to Kansas City to see the All-Star Game. And we had a great time. It was an awesome trip. And one of the things that we found out is that in addition to the game itself, they have a thing called All-Star Fan Fest. And it was at Fan Fest that we came across this panel discussion featuring former players from the Negro Leagues. And if you're not familiar with the Negro Leagues, basically in the first half of the 20th century, back when African American players weren't allowed to play in the major leagues, they formed their own professional leagues. And Negro Leagues baseball history has been an interest of mine for a while, and what that panel discussion really emphasized for me was something that, an element of that history that has, I find particularly interesting and has made me want to learn more about the topic. As many of you probably know, baseball, more than any other sport, is a game of statistics. As Bill James, the godfather of statistical analysis, would tell you, it's all about the numbers. It's the way that we measure players in baseball. It's the way that we compare players, particularly across different time periods. And when a player ends his career, we basically boil that player down to a series of numbers, and that's how they're remembered. For some players, that's how they get into the Hall of Fame. So really, it's a key part. Statistics are a key part of how the story of baseball is told. At least in the major leagues, it is. For the Negro Leagues, it's a little bit different story because the statistical information that's available from the Negro Leagues is really spotty and it's incomplete. There weren't official record keepers or statisticians keeping those numbers back in those days. And so, while we have bits and pieces of that data, we don't have the sort of comprehensive overall picture of the statistics like we do with the majority of Major League history. There have been some projects and there's been research over the years, and there continues to be research to try to gather more of that information, try and compile a more complete picture, which includes going through thousands of old box scores and newspapers, trying to find those numbers and those names. And there's been some great progress made, but unfortunately, we'll probably never have that complete picture. The sad fact is those players were not given the opportunity to compete against major league counterparts, and so we'll never have that direct comparison. We do know, though, that there were great legendary players in the Negro Leagues, like Satchel Paige. We'll never know for sure how many strikeouts Satchel racked up over the course of his career, but we do know that he routinely would call his outfielders in before an inning and then strike out the side. Cool Papa Bell may have been the fastest man that's ever played the game anywhere. And while we probably will never know how many bases he actually stole, according to the stories, he once stole 2 bases on 1 pitch. The legendary slugger of the Negro Leagues, Josh Gibson, will probably never have a concrete total of the home runs that he hit, although I've seen estimates that put it in the ballpark of 900 to give you some reference. But they say that he's the only man who's ever hit a ball all the way out of Yankee Stadium in New York. So, despite the lack of statistics, we have these stories, and we have the memories of the people who saw them play firsthand, and the other players who played alongside them. And that's really how the history of the Negro Leagues is being told. Now, I started my presentation talking about Kansas City, and it's not just because I'm a big Royals fan. Kansas City actually has a really strong link to the Negro Leagues and its history, beginning with the Monarchs, who were one of the great franchises of the Negro Leagues. They won 10 championships over the course of their existence. One of their great players, and later a manager for the Monarchs, was Buck O'Neil. Buck, after his baseball career, lived a long life and became basically an ambassador for the game of baseball. and in particular, the history of the Negro Leagues. And one of his great accomplishments later in life was as a driving force in the creation of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which is in Kansas City. I've had a chance personally to visit the museum a couple of times, and it's really a tremendous place. It does a great job of telling those stories and passing that history along to the current generation. Part of that history involves some of the greatest major leaguers who ever played. There's some familiar faces up there that you probably recognize. Jackie Robinson, obviously, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Monty Irvin. Some of those guys who were the greatest major leaguers who ever lived began their careers in the Negro Leagues. But there are thousands of others. Other players whose faces we wouldn't recognize, names that we don't know. And all of them have stories, and they're all a part of that history. And the museum is, like I said, it's a great resource, and it's one way that that history is being told. This is Bob Motley. My dad and I met Bob at FanFest. He was actually a part of that panel discussion I showed you at the beginning. Unlike the other gentlemen on the panel, Bob was not a player, but rather an umpire. And Bob was actually there selling his book. He wrote a book with his great stories from the Negro Leagues. What we found out listening to Bob speak is that he is the last remaining living umpire from the Negro Leagues. He's the last one. And what that really drove home for me is how important it is that we all now continue to hear those stories and learn that history, because Bob and his generation who lived it won't be around forever. So with that, if you're ever in Kansas City, I recommend you check out the museum, read Bob's book or any number of other great resources about the Negro Leagues, because I think it's a really important chapter, not only in baseball history, but in American history. And we can all be a part of keeping that history alive. Thank you.